Life is an edge phenomenon in the cosmos, something that has snuck in.
The Interplanetary podcast. The exploration of space for the benefit of all humankind. Your hosts in England and Sweden, Matthew, Russell and Linn Boldt-Christmas.
Do-da-do-da-do-da-do-da. Oh, yeah, baby. Michael Marshall.
So where is that from?
That's from Michael Marshall's book, The Genesis Quest.
Ooh.
The journey to uncover the origin of life on Earth.
That sounds epic in the literal sense.
Yeah. I don't know anything about the book, but I was looking for a quote about astrobiology.
Astrobiology. I mean, this is a great quote because I think it's true. Biology and life in general, it kind of sneaks in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not really... I mean, this is now a spiritual question very quickly, but I don't think life is very intentional.
No. Do you know what? I love this subject so much. I think in this interview that's coming up with an astrobiologist, no less, I kind of lose the plot a little bit. I get... You'll see.
Gobsmacked.
Over emotional about the whole thing. But I'll stand by it. I think this is one of the most important topics there is. What could be more important than our place in the universe? That's what we want. That's what we want to know, right?
That's why we're doing anything, right? I mean, it's such a dizzying concept, but I mean, if you keep asking why and you keep asking why, you kind of get to this shrug, but to actually find out where we come from, isn't that the most fundamental question of all?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't mind spending money trying to find that out. And I guess James Webb's about that. But who's our guest? Linn?
So our guest is Jessica Abbott, who is from the University of Lund here in Sweden. She's really, really great. So she works primarily in biology, but has taken an interest in sort of astrobiology. So I know her from that route because, I mean, I'm kind of on the planet side of astrobiology, and she's on the biology side of astrobiology. So I'm astro, she's biology. And this is something that we're going to talk about in this interview, but really... You need people from both sides, because if you want to talk about, okay, could life exist on this planet, let's say, you first need to figure out, well, how does life arise? And then you need to figure out, well, what is this planet like, right? So you really need collaboration between people from both sides of the fence, so to speak.
You need so many skills, don't you, with astrobiology?
Stupid. You need geology because you need to look about, the surface on this hypothetical planet. And therefore, you also need chemistry. You certainly need physics and astronomy. And you certainly need biology. But then you need to also factor in how things work in an extreme environment. This ain't your regular old Petri dish that we're talking about.
No, and you have to understand vast swathes of time. You have to know about evolution. You have to know about entropy. You have to know about, oh my God, it just goes on and on and on. You have to be all over it, don't you?
And I mean, this is in sort of modern academia, you have to be so specialized, right? I mean, a few thousand years ago, the sort of meme is that a few thousand years ago, you can be like, here are some thoughts I had in the bath about space and time by some Greek guy. And that was enough to get published. And I mean, now it has to be like, this is literally the first time that this particular parameter has been changed in this particular way, in this particular field, blah, 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 blah. And we're so far into research at this point that we need to become more interdisciplinary, I think, personally. I think that academia and even industry to an extent, you have so many deep dives and so many specialists. And fostering these kind of interdisciplinary sort of across the bridge working relationships is super important.
I guess a lot of this work gets done by the coffee machine.
That's a very clever coffee machine doing all this work.
Not by the coffee machine. But besides the coffee machine, yes. Yeah, but as in, people meeting up.
Absolutely.
Having little chats, which I guess is how you met Jessica, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah, she's been working with the Swedish Collegium of Advanced Study, which is a part, I think it's just here in Uppsala. It's very much an interdisciplinary collegium. Mm-hmm. And they do sort of astrobiology, and I think the catch-all title is life on other planets or something like this. So it's kind of like we mentioned, both from the astronomy side and the biology side. So she's been involved with that from the biology side. So it's very, very exciting. I really love interdisciplinary sort of clicks.
Well, I mean, you talked about specialization. Really, Jessica's specialization is in the genetics of sex differences, isn't it?
Yes, evolutionary biology, I believe.
And so I think this astrobiological bent is because she's working on a book with another colleague. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Jessica is working on a book that will come out in the near future. She'll mention it in Swedish about this kind of topic. So I'm definitely going to be the first person to buy it.
Oh well, yeah, and you're going to do an audio book for me.
Oh
into
yeah,
English.
exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Translating on the fly, and it will be a lot of like, oh, this word, it kind of means different, but not really. It's kind of and then it will be a very, very confusing audiobook.
Try not to do that. We'll get Jessica back on. Jessica's actually Canadian, isn't she originally?
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
And she speaks fluent Swedish. She won't brag about it, but geniuses are going to be like that.
It's making me a little bit jealous. Before we go on, I must thank the top-level patrons before we go any further. And they are the two Justins, as usual. Justin Roberts from the United Kingdom. Justin Young from Australia, Tasmania no less. Drew Wright from Texas. And Sigmund Eid from Norway.
Oh, hello.
So, yes, and I'll thank the rest of the patron gang at the end. Before we go to the interview, I just saw this story and I thought it was so exciting that King Tut, as in Tutankhamun, his dagger has turned out. I didn't realise this, but they've known this for a while. But the dagger that was found in the tomb is made from a meteorite.
What?
I know. So
No
I didn't know
way.
that. Now, I did know that Eskimos, or Inuits, as I suppose should be called, their cutlery comes from one meteorite.
Really?
Yeah, so that they, obviously they didn't have any kind of way of making metal ore.
Whale blubber doesn't make great hard tools.
So they all were just using this one block of iron.
Oh, I love that.
Meteorite, but Tutankhamun's dagger as well, and it's really obviously a meteorite as well because it has this thing called the Windmanstatten pattern.
Oh yes, of course.
Named after the Austrian mineralogist, and so yes, they know that it's probably of a certain type of meteorite. Sorry, well, yeah, it's a certain type of iron meteorite.
Meteorite, yeah.
From an asteroid.
Asteroids are the bigger ones. Meteor, and then oh my god, let's see if I remember this. If someone can correct me, you get a shout out next episode. I think it's meteoroid in space. Like a little fragment in space is a meteoroid, and then it's a meteor as it passes into the atmosphere, and then it's a meteorite as it is on the ground. Like if you find it on the ground already. I think that's it. Yeah.
So this is octahedrite, which is from the largest group of iron meteorites, yes.
Yeah.
But it's not likely to have been made in Egypt because I mean one of the reasons why they know this is probably a meteorite anyway was the fact that this is thousands of years before they would have been using they would have had the technology to forge their own iron. So it must have, they're literally doing very sort of warm,
right?
Or,
of course.
The way that they're doing,
it's like a naturally occurring iron, I guess.
Yeah, the way that they're forging it must be done at a low temperature, or else it would lose this incredible pattern that's actually in the blade itself.
Yeah,
and it's got these what look like rust spots, but they're not rust spots. They're actually kind of the patterns of.
Just cool patterns.
Just cool patterns, and you actually find these in Japanese swords as well. So this, so the iron, it's actually. You find them in samurai swords and stuff like that, where it's like a sort of highly prized thing to have. So
King Tut was just a big weeb. He just loved that cool.
Yes. So this actually, it may have been given to his family way, way, way back in the day. It doesn't even need to. It could have been a much older family heirloom that gets passed down because it's so special. Because obviously there can't be many of these things knocking about, right?
True. Yeah, that knife is definitely cursed. That is so cursed. I mean, what poor archaeologist pried this from his mummified hands? I mean, peace be upon you. That definitely sounds like a direct ticket to hexes. Sun god Ra maybe made that. I don't know.
So yeah, I just thought that was just worth mentioning that King Tutankhamun's dagger comes from outer space.
Amazing.
And I think they even used to call these metal objects stars as well, the Egyptians. So
Yeah?
they may have actually have known where they were from.
Yeah,
That they were
I mean,
that they had come sort of from outer space. That, when
that'd be,
people
I
had
mean,
picked them up
yeah.
off the floor after seeing them come in.
That's true. Yeah, I can definitely picture that. I mean, it's not even today. It's not unheard of. I mean, if you type in like meteor or something into the news, like it's not exactly a super rare occurrence to say like someone caught this meteor on camera or whatever. And I mean, think about how big the Earth is. I mean, they come in pretty regularly, and it's not that rare realistically to see one.
And I think one of the reasons why the Eskimos had them, the Inuits had them, was because you can see them quite clearly on the snow. So they're quite easy to they're quite easy to find. Easy. I say easy. Obviously, they're ridiculously hard to find. But you can see
if you
when
stumble upon one.
Yeah, but you can see them coming in, and if you're lucky, you can then sort of trace that line and find the little bits of iron and fish them in from a lake somewhere. It is pretty amazing. It's amazing that no one's ever been killed by one. Anyway, shall we?
As far as we know.
As far as we know, shall we go to our interview instead of messing around with trying to get some curse from Tutankhamun himself?
Okay, close this. Do your whatever ritual, like throw water over your left shoulder or whatever. And let's focus on happier things in space.
On happier things. So here is Jessica Abbott.
You're listening to the Interplanetary podcast, putting the ace back into space.
We're joined on the podcast by Jessica Abbott, an evolutionary biologist working in Sweden. Have I got that correct, Jessica?
Yes, that's correct.
And of course, I'm joined by my co-host, Linn. Hi, Linn.
Hello.
Right. So first of all, we got you on, Jessica, to talk about exobiology or
astrobiology.
Astrobiology.
As well.
Yeah,
that's right.
First of all, give us a rundown on what that actually entails.
Yeah, so I mean, this isn't something that I really do as part of my regular research, which is about the evolution of sex differences in sex chromosomes. It's more of a side project or sort of interest that I have on the side that I've been pursuing for several years, thinking about what types of life might be likely to occur on other planets, thinking about definitions of life as well. And the two are kind of linked. So I was part of an interdisciplinary project here in Linn a few years ago, which was about definitions of life. And that had grown out of a previous astrobiology project where the members of the group were sort of, they always came back to this question, if we want to look for different types of life forms outside of our own planet, then how do we know what to look for? Like, would we even recognize it if it's something totally different? And so that was really interesting. And it also got me thinking a little bit about, working on a book project and thinking about like how repeatable is evolution? If you see something that's evolved on Earth, how likely is it that it could evolve somewhere else? And so for me, that's what, this astrobiology is all about. Some people are focused more on the physical properties of the planet and how they would affect life. And I guess it depends on where your interests lie. But for me, it's more about, what type of solutions are likely to be common and what type of things are likely to be more idiosyncratic for the Earth.
I'm just sat here with like star eyes. I mean, I love astrobiology. I think it's such an amazing thing. And because I work on the climates of planets, I think it's a topic that goes really well with the sort of planetary science that is sort of booming right now. In recent years, people are getting really into actually characterizing planets and actually having some kind of idea of what things might be happening on planets. It's not that long ago we were able to first say, wow, there is, this particular chemical present on this planet. But to then actually say what is actually happening on a planet is a pretty big step. If aliens were watching Earth, for example, they might be like, nitrogen atmosphere, approximately 15 degrees. But then you look at the icebergs versus deserts versus rainforests and, I actually have a question, because this was a question that a student gave me recently, and I couldn't answer it because my biology knowledge was lacking.
Okay, well, we'll see if I can do it.
Well, I mean, it's pretty abstract, but, people often, when you talk about, we're looking for life and stuff like this, people sort of push their glasses up their noses and then they say, well, what about life that we don't know what to look for? We have the Goldilocks zone, and so we're looking for liquid water. But what if there's another type of life that could arise from a different type of environment? And then the follow-up question that someone said to me was, we assume carbon-based life usually, and like that's what we know. Say that there was another kind of blank-based life. Do we even know what their, proteins would look like, their amino acids? Would they have to have a different, molecular structure or composition? I'm really showing here how I did not do biology beyond GCC, but the different things that make up the things in the biology.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, would they be completely different as well?
Yeah, so this is something that's getting into the realm of chemistry more than biology almost, because the reason why people are so, interested in water and carbon is just because it seems like those molecules and atoms have a lot of really favorable properties. So that water being a polar liquid means that you can have lots of interactions, and molecules interacting in special ways because of that. And carbon can build lots of bonds and things. And so, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's impossible that you could have life with a completely different chemistry. I do think it would be difficult for us to recognize it. But it certainly seems like, at least for life on the type of time scales that we live on, that those two in combination are pretty good. Because you could imagine that, if you think silicon-based life, well, you can't really have anything much happening in terms of reactions, if things are solids rather than liquids. So then it would have to be super high temperatures. You could also imagine that you might have other types of solvents, but then, maybe like reactions go really slow, and so then maybe it would take a long time for something to evolve, and maybe it would all be happening so slowly that we can't really see it. If you've ever seen one of these speeded up films of a plant growing, and you can see how fast they move, so I could imagine that there could be some types of life that would be more or less inaccessible to us, just because they might be on a time scale that would be too fast or too slow for us to even really recognize it as being a living organism.
That's true. And I mean, if you need a hot planet, we've got plenty of those.
True.
we have a lot of planets, these hot Jupiters usually. I think that's really the astrochemist is what astrophysicist and astrobiologist needs to bridge that gap, to bridge the understanding, I think, probably.
Yeah, and I asked a colleague of mine who's a chemist who's also interested in sort of astrobiology and was part of this astrobiology project here in Lund a number of years ago, what he thought about sort of life in interstellar clouds, for example. And he made the argument that that's probably not very likely, just because they're so thin and because the molecules interact with each other so rarely that probably it would be impossible for anything to really get going. So there's those sorts of considerations. But I mean, one thing that has been clear over the past 50 years of biology is that, people have been setting up these sorts of limits of where they think life can exist. And then as soon as you start looking, you see that there are things that are beyond these limits. So I think we need to be a little bit humble and not be too categorical of saying, it needs to be water, it needs to be carbon.
Exactly.
Yeah, that might be the most sort of likely thing out there, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the only option.
Yeah, because that's the argument when we look at planet atmospheres and, we look in say, the quote habitable zone. Really, our only argument is we have one example of life working there. We have 0 examples of the other one. One is more than 0.
Yeah.
So it's not a good sample size, but it's a non-zero one.
Yeah, it's true. And that's basically sort of the problem all the time when it talks about, whenever you're going to talk about astrobiology questions, is that we just have a sample size of 1. So how can you say anything? In that sense, I do think that looking at sort of, parallel evolution on Earth of similar sorts of solutions to things can be useful, because then you could say, okay, at least if you have this type of chemical system, then this type of solution has arisen multiple times independently of each other, which probably means that it's not that difficult to evolve.
I always think that it kind of comes down to how are you actually defining life? Because we haven't even decided that with the life or the non-life that we have. Yeah, what is life? I mean, because often when people talk about viruses, and obviously we've been talking about viruses for the last 2 years non-stop, it's like, something like COVID, do you consider it life, or where do you actually draw the line? What would you consider? What is your definition of life?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I've been working together with a philosopher on trying to develop some new approach to defining life, which is more about like clusters of properties that they have in common, rather than sort of it's based on Wittgenstein's family resemblance ideas about the definitions of things. And so then the idea, and a typical definition, a Dewey definition, as it's called, is that you have a list of criteria and all of them have to be fulfilled for this thing to belong to this category. But that doesn't seem to work very well with life. I mean, you can read in a textbook, sort of maybe 7 different properties that are associated
Mrs.
with
Grant,
life.
I remember from biology, like when I was 13. That one.
Exactly, like homeostasis, movement, and blah blah blah. But you can always find exceptions, more or less, or things and things that are not living, but that could fulfill most of these things. So it's really complicated. And I mean, when it comes to viruses specifically, that's also really interesting, because that's something where if you read in textbooks and if you talk to a lot of biomedical researchers, they will be kind of categorical, absolutely not. But I did a little survey of people at my department and asked them, and about 50% of them said that they thought that viruses should be considered living. And if you look at the NASA sort of working definition of life, chemical system, self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, well, that's definitely applicable to viruses. So I think a case can be made for considering them alive.
Yeah.
But it's not. I think the problem is that it's really difficult to say that it's an either-or thing, that there maybe is some sort of continuum of things that are more living to less living, right? And the viruses might be at one end and something like humans are at the other. But if you take something like a mitochondrion, which are the cell components in our cells that help produce energy, they have their own DNA. They can replicate themselves independently. They can move around independently, but then they can also fuse to each other and they can do all kinds of weird things. And they can't live outside of our cells. But they were originally an independent life form that then became part of our cells through symbiosis. So where do they fit in? Who knows?
Yeah, you kind of can be even more ridiculously outlandish and sort of bring in all those kind of things. Well, what we don't even know what consciousness is, so that therefore, like, you can even have, some people like panpsychists would say a rock is conscious. So it's like it's like you've kind of got real problems there, haven't you, as well? It's. I guess you could, like, complex systems. Just because it's complex, is it starting to become lifelike? Or there obviously needs to be some other element to it. And does it really matter? Because you've got this thing of, if we do find life on an exoplanet using James Webb and seeing like some signature of what we would consider life, we can't communicate with it and we can't really see what it is that's doing it. So is that something that's bothersome in terms of, well, you can do all that work, but really you never really see, well, it's going to be a very long way off before you actually see what it is that you're actually dealing with. The exciting bit.
Yeah, true. I mean, I don't know. I think that if as is my sort of gut feeling, that it's maybe not that difficult for life to arise in various sorts of situations, then we could potentially find life within our own solar system eventually. That might not be so easy, and it might not be, but it's still probably easier than finding it somewhere far away. And yeah, I think it would be to some extent frustrating to, have signatures of life be discovered somewhere, but then not be able to go and actually investigate it. But on the other hand, I think it would be so fascinating as a biologist just to have oh, we know there's another data point out there.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that the happiness would sort of overwhelm the disappointment.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also another whole stage to unpack, which is what would even be considered a signature, because it's like, okay, if we literally find sort of Philip K. Dick style civilizations rising out of the clouds of an exoplanet, probably some kind of life going on there, right? But there's such, like you say, there's such a spectrum that if you find, okay, you might find, quote, building blocks, like something that could be a precursor to life. Is that a life detection? And then there's as we know from Earth, there was a long period where there was, quote, life on Earth, but not really anything that we would recognize as things being alive. So it's a really big gray area, I guess.
Well, exactly. And I mean, if nothing else, that's an argument for focusing on the carbon and water form of life that we're familiar with, just because that's the sort of thing that we would have the best chance to detect signatures of. Like, what would be the signature of some weird type of life that we don't even understand? You wouldn't be able to find it. So I think that there's a case that can be made for sort of mainly thinking about that type of life, just because there's going to be a bias in terms of what we can even detect.
If there's likelihood of kind of biological life that's pretty, I guess, doesn't even need to be similar to ours, but is the idea of a sex important for evolution itself? Because it seems that that's kind of like a driver of evolution. But I don't know what the examples are on Earth of asexual reproduction, and whether that would be something that you would consider universal, or something that's we're just lucky enough to have on Earth, if you see what I mean.
Right. So this is a really good question. It's getting closer to my actual sort of research focus. So there's a lot that I could say here. I'll try to keep it reasonably short. Okay. So the thing is that sex has been a big puzzle for evolutionary biologists for a long time, because if you could just make a copy of yourself, why wouldn't you do that? You know, if you're already well adapted to your environment, why would you want to mix genes with some other individual that's maybe not as well adapted? Plus, if you always have to find a partner, then there's going to be a lot of costs associated with that. Whereas if you are in a good situation and you have lots of energy and you can just divide like a bacterium, or you can just, lay an unfertilized egg that hatches into another individual, why wouldn't you do that? It seems like it's a big waste of time and energy. So it seems like there's kind of two main advantages to sex. One of them is that it allows more rapid adaptation. So if you are well adapted, it's maybe not so good. But if you're in an environment that you're not perfectly adapted to, it's maybe good to mix up your genes with someone else's and produce variable offspring so that they can maybe be more adapted, or that they can even colonize new environments, for example. So it seems like sex can speed up the rate of adaptation. So that's something that can be sort of useful in terms of producing complexity. It also seems like sex is important for DNA repair. And the current theory today is basically that was more or less the original function of sex. It's not so much that it was about mixing up your genes, it was more about being able to repair mutations. So by comparing your genetic material with another individual's, then you could repair mutations, and everything else that has come afterwards is sort of an add-on in a way.
A bonus.
So, yeah, exactly. So in that sense, I mean, I think that any type of organism would need some sort of mechanism for repairing its genetic material, whatever is containing the information that it's using to build its bodies. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be through anything similar to sex, and it wouldn't have to be that you would have two sexes. That does seem to be a stable state with just two, which is why that's so common everywhere. And there's various reasons why you could imagine. I mean, if you're not able to just have sex with kind of any other individual, that it would make sense that you would have two, because if you need a third partner, then you have all of these additional sort of costs with trying to find that partner and that kind of thing. So it seems like that's when you get to that point, then that's kind of stable. So so it could be that you could develop some sort of system where you have two partners that have to somehow collaborate to produce an offspring, but there's absolutely no reason
collaborate.
To think. Yeah, exactly. Somehow.
Is that what the kids are calling it?
Well, but I mean, it wouldn't necessarily have to be that you would have to combine your genetic material in the same way.
Sure.
that organisms on Earth do. So it's one of these things where I think that the repair aspect is probably fairly universal, but the actual diversity aspect is probably not, and having males and females is probably not universal.
That's a really interesting angle. And, we talk also about on Mars and Venus, and we know that they had very different climates before. It's so long also been a question of, maybe there was life once upon a time there, and would there still be signs of that? And I've always thought that it would be an interesting question of, if life begins somewhere, will it always kind of remain? And I guess it's a question of what evolves faster, sort of the climate of the planet or the evolution of whatever life species is on there. So that's a really interesting angle, that, actually having some kind of driver to I guess they would evolve faster. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, yeah, they can potentially adapt faster.
Yeah.
We have to be a little bit careful here, because there are other alternatives to sex that bacteria have, for example, because they've been super successful. So they have other mechanisms for exchanging DNA with each other. That's not really the same as sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is something that is really associated with more complex eukaryotic cells, like our type of cells. But there's a lot of more simple organisms that don't do it all the time. They would only do it when they need to, or, if it's a stressful environment, then they might go through a sexual reproductive cycle, and then the rest of the time they might just divide. And that is kind of the best of both worlds in a way. But it seems like that might be hard to do for a large, like, multicellular organism. Yeah. So I think that, my guess is that most of the stuff that's out there is bacteria, just because, like you were mentioning previously, there's been this big, long stretch of time on Earth where there was nothing but simple microorganisms. And it took quite a while before we started producing more complex life. So those types of microorganisms, they can have really rapid adaptation because they have such short generation times, and if they have mechanisms for exchanging DNA with each other, then I think that they could keep up with sort of changes on a geological scale.
Do you have a sort of gut feeling for things like that? The Fermi paradox and the Great Filter. Do you have a sort of feeling about whether there are these great filters, whether that, the Cambrian explosion, for example, is an incredibly unlikely event, and we just so happen to have had it? Do you have a gut feeling about where some of those sort of real biological kind of bottlenecks must be?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of this book project that I've been working on for a few years, which is, I've made some progress on it, but it's still taking a long time. That's kind of what we want to get at. Like, a lot of people who are not biologists, when they talk about life in the universe, they see the origin of life as being the big bottleneck, that it's difficult for life to arise, and that once it arises, it's probably likely to become complex, or that's more or less inevitable. I think this is probably partially like a bit of a misunderstanding of evolutionary theory, because often people have this idea, survival of the fittest, and there's going to be, always competition, and then that means the complexity is always better. And so as soon as you have the process get started, then you will inevitably become complex. But that's not really the case if you look at organisms on Earth. Like, for one thing, as I say, you have these big, long stretches of time where there doesn't really seem to be much happening in terms of complexity, even though there, might have been more complex ecosystems being built up or whatever. But individual organisms didn't really seem to be becoming more complex. So I think it's more a matter of that any sort of change or increase in complexity will have costs that come with it, so that it's not always clear that this is the best thing to do. So intelligence is a really good example. We have, we're really smart, and we therefore think that it must be good. But having a big brain is really costly. And so you need to have some sort of situation where the benefits that you can get from increasing brain size more than outweigh the costs, for example, in terms of energy that you need to fuel this brain. And there's obviously a lot of organisms where that hasn't been adaptive, because not all organisms out there have big brains. The majority of them don't.
Do you need to be smart? I guess not to survive.
No. And there's plenty of examples as well of organisms that have been more complex and then become less complex, like various types of parasites that were free living and then they become less complex as they adapt to the internal environment of the host.
Intelligent parasites.
No. But I mean, there's always, and in that sense, evolutionary biology is really kind of economic science, that you're always having to think about these costs and benefits to
supply and demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the most extraordinary for that, I think, is consciousness, because it must come with a huge cost. Yet doesn't seem to have any actual benefit.
Just gives us anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's that's a really fascinating element of it, isn't it? You're tracing a cost benefit analysis. But clearly life hasn't done that, has it? It hasn't necessarily followed the path of cost benefit, because you have all those. You have things like intelligence. But what's the other drivers? What are the other potential drivers of it then?
I mean, there's some influence of chance as well. I mean, you have to have the genetic variants that will appear to produce a new trait in order for that trait to even get started. So you could imagine that you have some sort of constraints in terms of maybe it would be really good to evolve this behavior at this particular time, but you don't end up getting the mutation that would give it to you, and then you go extinct. So there could be some avenues like that get closed off just by random chance. But I mean, no, it's more a matter of I think that it's pretty rare that you find examples that don't really follow this cost-benefit analysis. It's more that you need to think about the fact that every organism is adapted to its own sort of niche, and so they can do what they need to do, and they tend to not do a bunch of stuff that they don't need to do. So if you look at, say, a domestic animal, they tend to be less intelligent if you give them various types of intelligence tests than the wild version of the same one, probably because they don't need to solve problems in the same way because we take care of them. But they also tend to be better at social interactions, for example. So, and there's been examples of, people working on guppies and selecting on brain size. And then you can see that if you're selecting on brain size, then yes, they can grow bigger brains, but it comes at the cost of something else. And so then they had shorter guts in this particular study. And so if you have a shorter gut, then maybe you can't break down food as efficiently. So you would need to have some sort of situation where the gain in brain size would be enough that you'd be getting more extra food so that it wouldn't matter that you sort of lost some of your feeding efficiency or breaking down food efficiency, so to speak.
Yeah. And I guess it's also, from what I remember from school, I mean, evolution is more lazy than, concerned with your quality of life. And it's also more like if there's no cost with, for example, we have our appendix still, which we don't really use, but there's not really been an initial, a reason to get rid of it. So it's kind of there. And it's more, it doesn't cost anything per se for us to have a little shriveled appendix.
Yeah,
fossil.
Exactly. And
so it's
what we usually say is that the evolution can't look forward, right? So the organisms are just responding to whatever challenges that they have in their environment
living in
today.
the moment.
Yeah. And so even if this might lead to some sort of solution that's suboptimal in the future, then that doesn't matter because you don't know what's coming in the future, or it's a process that doesn't have any sort of way to look forward. And then this can, as you say, lead to sort of things that are maybe not ideal from the perspective of the individual, or that could lead to kind of bad solutions. I mean, there's lots of examples
female
of that.
Menstruation. I feel like that's a pretty big design flaw.
Exactly.
The size of the birth canal and our brains is another sort of weird.
And humans have very stupid babies. They're like deer. They go running off after God knows how long, and we have not quite 18 years, maybe more like 25 until we're really, really mature.
Exactly. But when you start thinking about all of these costs to various types of adaptations and complex adaptations, then it becomes clear how this might not be something that would happen all the time. It might not be something that would happen on another planet. Is there any particular reason to expect that the same process would occur? If it depends a lot on sort of the available genetic variation, the specific, selective environment at the time, that kind of thing. And if you're going to have major changes, like say these mitochondria in our cells that have come from a symbiosis with a bacterium, then that's something where this sort of cooperation between the two types of cells probably had to go on for a really, really long time in order for, and so then you would have to have an environment that would be favoring this type of cooperation for a very, very long time. And then that might be something that doesn't occur that often, actually.
I mean, it's almost unbelievable the level of complexity of a human being, isn't it? That we've had a planet that's been stable enough for long enough to do something like that. I mean, it does. Like the more you kind of break down the thought of how hard it is to get to something like a human, you do sort of realize the kind of improbability of like intelligent life. But as a gut feeling, if we're talking about intelligent life, do you have a gut feeling on that about whether we will in any way ever come across an exoplanet with intelligent life on that that's reasonably close? I mean, do you have a kind of feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, so my feeling is no, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, I mean, getting back to your original question about Fermi's paradox, to me, that I think is the answer, is just that there's probably lots of life out there, but it's probably 99.9% simple life. Or 95% simple life or something, and that it's actually difficult to get something that we would recognize as being intelligent. And not that it's not out there, because there are so many planets that there's still going to be lots and lots of examples of intelligent life. It's just that they're probably going to be relatively few and far between, and maybe so far away that we won't really have any chance to interact with them. Unfortunately, I know that it's a bummer, but
it is a bummer, but it also, I kind of see it as a kind of profound thought as well. Like as in, if science is kind of pointing in that direction that potentially we are alone, then we suddenly have this enormous responsibility, don't we? That we're the only meaning in the universe. We're the only thing that has. It's like it just seems to be like it does seem to be like profoundly important work that people like you are doing.
Well, thank you.
I mean, that's kind of, the more I talk about subjects like this, it's like, it's incredible. Do you ever do you feel like that? Do you feel like it's an important thing? Because it's one of those things. If you're in a cab ride, I should imagine that people go, "Oh, you're an exobiologist." They would say,
"You again,
what's all that about?" What's all that about? But it's,
well, like I say, I moonlight as an exobiologist. I mean, because there are lots of other people who work on this more seriously than I do. No, I don't know. I mean, the way, and as I've been thinking about this more and working on the book project and stuff, then it's forced me to think about these things a little bit more rigorously. And instead of being like, well, that seems to have happened a lot, then that's probably common, to actually think about, well, how do we judge? How would we judge whether something is likely or not? And I kind of feel that by looking at the history of life on Earth, there's two types of information that we can get. And one is how many, which I mentioned before, how many times something has evolved independently of each other, but also how long it took for it to evolve, kind of the waiting time for it to evolve. And that if something has evolved only once and it took a long time for it to happen, then this is probably something that's not really easy to get, and maybe not going to be so frequent on other planets. Whereas if you take something like the evolution of senses, eyes and things like that, that's happened a bunch of times in completely separate lineages. And of course, being able to sense and experience your environment is pretty obviously a good thing. So that's maybe not so surprising. So there's certain things that maybe seem kind of trivial, but when you actually start thinking about it in this type of way, what type of information do we have that we can use to, say this is a likely sort of thing to happen, this is an unlikely sort of thing to happen, then I think you can get a better idea of what things are possible or plausible and what things are maybe less plausible.
There was a paper I read quite recently about metals and proteins, the way that they bind to metals, and how that originally starts off when you've got these kind of very young planets. Do you think over the next few years people will start to be able to kind of look at the chemistry of a particular star system or a planet and actually sort of rule out life like we know it, because it won't really have the necessary ingredients for the right types of proteins to develop and eventually become DNA or some kind of self-replicating proteins.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that always bearing in mind that just because it's not like our type of life doesn't mean that you can't have life at all. But yeah, I certainly think that there could be sort of the possibility to get information to be able to make that kind of judgment call. When you talk about sort of the use of metals and things in our organic molecules, I think that's also really an interesting thing to consider in terms of like, are there specific times when it might be more favorable for life to have arisen? Once life has arisen, then it seems like there's, with this sort of homeostasis, trying to keep a constant internal environment, that there seems to be a lot of advantage to continuing to have this sort of setup, even if the external environment has been changed, either through geologic processes or the existence of life itself, so that this is no longer the case. So then there's, for example, this idea that the salt balance in our cells is somehow related to the salt levels in the very early oceans. And that's not what it's like nowadays, but it's something that has been potentially kept for a very, very long time. So I think that there's also lots of interesting things that one could think about there in terms of, how does planetary evolution influence when it might be more likely for certain types of life to arise? I mean, I think it's certainly possible that you could have had multiple origins of life on Earth, and then all that's left is one type, just because that's what's persisted. Doesn't necessarily mean that our type is the best type or the optimal type. It could be by chance, right? I mean, it could be that you had two different types of life that arose on different sides of the planet, and then one side got hit by a meteor, and and then that type of life was gone and it never came back. So it wouldn't always have to be that that the one that's left is the best one. But I certainly think that, that you could have multiple origins of life early in the evolution of a planet, but eventually probably one of them will take over and become dominant. So it's, so I think it's unlikely that you would see multiple like separate origins of life on a given planet, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, this is now exactly the Venn diagram overlap between our fields, and I think with when you're asking, can life evolve on this planet, then it's kind of our two fields, the sort of what do you need for life and what is this planet like. Those two kind of have to work towards each other, because you kind of need both sides to answer the question. Because say that we knew everything about how life evolved. Say that we had the blueprint and we're like, okay, you need the degrees to be between 15 and 25. You need like this percentage of oxygen or whatever. Say you knew everything. Then you would be stuck with, okay, well, how do we confirm that this planet actually has that environment? Because that's hard to do. And then if you flip it around and you say, okay, say we knew everything about this planet, say we know exactly what its weather conditions are, we can have a iPhone weather app for the next 7 days, we know that every part of this planet, then you would be stuck with asking, well, does that mean that life could arise here? Because both of those are such hard questions to answer. And if you manage to answer one of them, you still have to answer the other to get the full story. Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I think is interesting in terms of like work on the origin of life that people have been, doing since the 50s, in terms of like what sort of conditions will lead to the production of organic molecules and more complex molecules and things. I think that it's, the kind of thing where people maybe feel like, oh, we're never going to know. And of course, we can't go back in time and observe the origin of life on Earth. But I mean, we can get some sort of plausible scenario by investigating all of these different types of combinations of, temperature and availability of components and things like that. And so I think that type of work, even if we can never say exactly how life started on Earth, is also going to be useful in terms of thinking about the broader universe. Like if this seems like that could potentially be a path towards having life get started, then it's worth thinking about, okay, what planets might have those sorts of conditions. And I mean, there's no shortage of weird life on Earth, right? There's is it called extremophiles? The little weird, crazy critters.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that's the appropriate biological term, but yeah, weird life in like bottom of volcanoes and stuff. So I mean, yeah, again, if we're asking under what conditions can life arise, it seems to be pretty broad anyway, if we're talking about fairly simple life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm always amazed by the things that bacteria can do, and other microorganisms. They can live anywhere, they can eat anything, and they can do all kinds of crazy things.
Like the ones found in nuclear power stations and things like that. Isn't it?
Exactly.
It's just any energy gradient, and they're there.
Yep.
Like it's just crazy. Well, I mean, if it go back to something that you said right at the beginning about finding life in the solar system, that you thought that was quite likely, or
how possible.
Well, it's possible, yeah, and it's like do you buy into the panspermia idea that because there seems to be a lot of mixing of rocks across all the different planets of the solar system, bits of Earth are found all over the shop, even on the moons of Jupiter and things. Therefore, if life arises on one planet in your system, is it quite likely that then spreads, with very, very basic life forms to other bodies in that system?
I think it's hard for me to say whether it's likely or not, not knowing in enough detail about sort of the movement of pieces of things around the solar system. But I mean, yeah, it's certainly possible from a biological point of view that you could have some sort of simple microorganism, some sort of bacterium or something. And if it's in some spore format that's particularly hardy, and it's maybe sort of in the middle of a chunk of material, that it could survive and, end up somewhere else. And I mean, honestly, and thinking about, if we do find life elsewhere in the solar system, and it turns out that basically all of it has the same origin, that everything came from Mars and then spread to the Earth or vice versa, I still think that would be super interesting from the point of view of a biologist, because it would only be very simple organisms that would be able to be transported, and it was probably something that happened quite a long time ago. So it wouldn't be a second origin of life, but you'd be talking about evolutionary histories that have been separate for so long that presumably they would have evolved very different solutions to the problems that they experienced, and that they would be fundamentally different in many ways. And I think that would be super interesting to be able to investigate.
And I mean, it kind of doesn't even answer the question anyway. Let's say that all life came from Mars. Okay, well, where did that come from? Because the solar system was formed, out of a sort of disk of ice and dust and debris in that way. I mean, so it still had to enter the stage at some point in time in that case. So if you just said, oh, it's fine, life came from Mars, that doesn't really close the case.
No, exactly. And I mean, you could simulate, environments on early Mars instead of on early Earth, and try to understand how life could get started. And I think that would be just as interesting and useful, given that we don't know for sure. I mean, it's like asking what was before the Big Bang. You could just kind of keep asking that question, and before that.
Yeah, but there's a really interesting thing, isn't there? Where if you went to Mars and you found life, but you could really tell that it had the same origins as life on Earth. That's very different to finding life on Mars that really doesn't have any connection to life on Earth, and then it would complete, that. They have, both of those have like really profound meaning, don't they, really?
In different ways.
Well, exactly. And I mean, of course, it would be even more interesting if we had a second origin of life, or third or fourth somewhere else in the solar system. But it's more that sometimes when you talk to people, I get the impression that they think that, oh, well, if it was just Earth bacteria that ended up on Mars or vice versa, then who cares? But I think that would be super interesting.
Yeah, I mean... I kind of get the point, though. I suppose it's not as interesting as a second origin of life, or that would be even more interesting, especially if it was very clear that that this type of life had a different biochemistry. Because then, even if it was still a variant on water and carbon, but things were built up in a different way, then that would be really fascinating to study from just the perspective of how do the reactions work? What would be this sort of well, the cool one would be Titan, wouldn't it? If life had sort of started in the Europa, but like the Titan, you'd have to have completely different sort of
Yeah.
chemical start, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
I'm excited just thinking about it.
But then that would also have implications for, being able to look at other planets and say whether they might potentially be inhabited or inhabitable. If we had a concrete example of an alternative type of life, then we could study that and then extend that to.
Yeah.
Whereas now we're just kind of stuck with looking for things that are like us.
Yeah. The sample size of one.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the annoying thing. A sample size of one is terribly weak, isn't it?
Yeah.
As a
It's bad data.
Well-
place to start.
Science.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, when it comes to the origin of life, then that's always going to be the case. But that's why I think it's interesting to think about these other steps in terms of, on the way to intelligence and complexity, because that's something where we potentially do have multiple origins and can actually, we can have multiple sources of information, even though it's all coming from this single origin of life, that we can get a bit more information when it comes to those later steps.
And I mean, could you argue that there are multiple origins, quote, origins on life, in the sense that, the nuclear power plant, the bacteria, a good example, that was a new environment that we created less than 100 years ago. And now there's a life that presumably did not exist before then. So, I mean, I guess new life kind of springs up here and there on a regular basis anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could argue that
But does that happen in a vacuum?
Are new life forms, so.
Yeah. Well, does that happen in a vacuum when we have new species that spring up? Like, are they always related to something else?
Yeah. So, I mean, everything that we have studied to date is related to each other, and you can tell by the sort of biochemical similarities. Some things are, farther apart. It's been a longer time. So that they're more different from each other. And I mean, I suppose it's possible that you could have, if you have the same building blocks available, that you could have the same type of life that actually arose in more than one place on the planet, but you just can't tell the difference. And it's also really complicated with these, with the first transition to a life form, because you are initially talking about some sort of chemical system that's dynamic, and then this has to somehow become individuals that are reproducing themselves. So I mean, you could also have multiple systems that then combined and ended up producing your initial individual or individuals.
Yeah, I've never thought about that. I mean, I guess a distinguishing feature of life is that it's a collection of individual living things.
That you mentioned them earlier, the mitochondria, and it's like that whole thing that they've entered another organism, and that's kind of, thank goodness they did, because that's why we're here, kind of thing. But a similar sort of thing happened with am I right in saying a similar sort of thing happened with chlorophyll? Yes. For the plant kingdom, etc.
The chloroplasts, that do photosynthesis. Yes, and actually,
so there's an example of two things, isn't there? So there's an example of two.
So there's two. Actually, there's a third one potentially, which is worth mentioning, because it gets back to this idea about sort of individuality and what's a life form versus not a life form. And so, like a cell from your body, you wouldn't really say that that's a life form because it can't exist on its own. But it might be sort of a living component, right? So there's these amoeba called Polynella, and they have a cyanobacterium that has become a symbiote and is kind of on its way to becoming a cell component. So in terms of like the number of genes and how independent they are and stuff, it's kind of like halfway between a free living bacterium and a chloroplast. And so different people, some of them want to call it an organelle, a cell component. Some of them want to say, no, it's just a really derived symbiote. And so there's not a consensus because we're kind of in the middle of this process. And so that's why I think it's really difficult to talk about sort of, life versus non-life in a really categorical way, because partially when you're talking about the origin of life, it would have to be some reasonably gradual progression. And also, even when we look at organisms today, you can see things that are kind of somehow in between, like viruses is another example. And there's various theories about where viruses come from. There's some that could be sort of genes that transposable elements that they're called, that could copy themselves between different parts of the genome that acquired some sort of protein coats so that then they could start moving around between organisms and not just within an organism. But there's also a theory that it could be that they originally came from something like a bacterium that infected a cell and then just basically outsourced more and more of its functions until in the end, it only kept the most essential things. And then in that kind of sense, you have a de-origin of life in a way. You have something that's gone from being alive to not necessarily being alive anymore. Which I think is super interesting to think about.
Oh my God, yeah, that's insane.
When you said that all of life, though, I guess in every sense of the word, is all related, I think first of all that's really cool, and I hadn't considered that. Does that mean that do we have common ancestry with viruses as well?
Well, that's a good question in the sense that if the viruses arose from a bacterium or something, then not directly but indirectly, yes, that everything can sort of go back to some initial origin. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Some starting point, and then you've had various.
Amazing.
But it's more like a network. It's not just like a branching tree.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it the first few letters of every single life?
So you can have these, organisms that jump back and forth, and
that's so cool.
Yeah, so I mean, the genetic code is the same. There are some microorganisms that have some small differences there, which suggests that they split off from the rest of life so early on that they have gone a slightly different route. But basically all of the genetic information and all of the sort of types of molecules that we use are all the same.
But I guess that's an important distinction, the splitting off very early on versus arising on its own. Because
exactly. And so that's the thing, is that all of the variety of life that we see and things that are very different from us, like archaea and bacteria and stuff, then it just seems to be because the split occurred very, very early on. But we don't have any good evidence, at least, that there was a second origin of life.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying, isn't it? I mean, that's just one of the sort of great filters. But if there's only, like you said, there could have been multiple origins, but they're lost to us now because one dominates. And
yeah, exactly.
I mean, reassuring. I'm glad that we're not like battling some like neo species of some horrible primate that arose from a second origin. Something like very sci-fi.
Well, I get that could happen, couldn't it? You could have an islandized kind of planet where you've got one biosystem on one hemisphere and another biosystem on another, where they really couldn't
one
mix.
System, two systems.
Well, like these proteins that have chirality and all those kind of things. You'd have completely different. Yeah,
life is terrifying.
Well, it is. The other thing that you have to think about when you talk about life, and when you were talking about energy gradients, the thing is that as soon as there's an unused niche, then there's an opportunity, right? I had someone who asked me a question once about ticks. Why do ticks exist? What function do they serve in nature? And I was like, they don't serve a function. Their only function is to make more of themselves. No, but it's. I mean, the reason why everything looks like it fits together so well in an ecosystem is just because if there's a lot of something that isn't being used, then any individual that can make use of it is going to have a huge advantage. And so then you don't see a lot of waste, and you don't see a lot of stuff just lying around that's potentially, can be used as energy that doesn't get used, just so things that eat wood and stuff like that. But that's just because any individual or any organism or any species that manages to do that, they're going to do so well. So that's also the way you can think about it when it comes to, origins of life, and if you could have two different types of life on one planet, it's possible. But even if you think that they might have say different chirality from the beginning, well, then any mutant individual that was able to eat life of the opposite chirality would be super successful, and so
and win.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean that everything is always about sort of eating the competition, but more that you need to think, because there's lots of examples of cooperation leading to evolutionary change as well. But rather that you need to think about and that's why we can see organisms that have so many different types of energy that they can use, just because any time you see something unused, then that's a major opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we've seen even on Earth, even in real time in our lifetime, that ecosystems are fragile, and I mean, changes can happen on short scales, I guess.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But I mean, examples of like bacteria that have evolved to be able to break down plastic and things like that.
Yeah.
Like that's a resource that suddenly has become really abundant.
Yeah. Oh, yum! There's lots of plastic here.
So I think that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to like these multiple origins of life, and I don't know if it's really so much that the fact that we only see one is sometimes on Earth, one type of life is sometimes used as an argument that it must be a difficult thing to achieve. But I think about it more in terms of the time aspect, that it seems like Earth arose very, very early, as soon as the sort of crust was stable enough that it would even be feasible. So to me, that suggests that it's probably not that difficult to evolve, and there might have been multiple origins. And it's just that now that so much time has gone past, the other ones have gone. This is a pretty common problem in evolutionary biology when you're looking at fossils, right? That you have limited evidence left. You could take a specific group that now isn't very speciose. There might only be like one or two organisms left. But if you think, okay, well, they're not very successful. But then if you have fossil evidence, you could say, oh, look, this used to be a super successful group, and then just a lot of them disappeared.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that kind of evidence, and everything that happened so long ago on Earth that we're talking about microorganisms, there's no fossil leftovers, so we can't really know for sure.
Survivor bias.
Exactly. So you have this really big effect of, well, what we see is what is left. It doesn't mean that it's everything that there was.
Yeah, the victor's right history in the biological history.
It's been really awesome. Thanks. Some really interesting things to think about there. We'll have to get you back on. When do you think you'll finish your book?
Okay, so I was
no, that's a big question.
No, but it's been a side project. I'm working on it together with a friend of mine who's a science journalist. And so we're trying to write kind of half each, like every second chapter, right? And so we've been working on it for a long time. And I did a kind of mini sabbatical last fall to work on it. And I got pretty far with it. I wrote like 4 of 6 planned chapters in draft. And we've been in touch with a publisher and stuff. So now it's, she needs to get a bit caught up on doing some of her chapters, and I need to write the last couple so that we can then, send it off to the publisher and see what they think. So yeah, I became head of my department this year. So that's eating up a lot of time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to try to get a big chunk of the book done in the fall before that happened. So, I mean, I'm optimistic that it will get done at some point, but it's not going to be like next month.
Yeah.
Hopefully this year, I would say.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
There we go. So that was Jessica. I massively enjoyed that chat, Lynn.
I loved it. Always such a pleasure. I would love to invite her again ASAP because I have so many more questions.
I know. Well, that was the thing, isn't it? With these interviews, you go away and go, I wish I'd asked that. So we definitely, when the book's finished, we'll get Jessica back on.
Yeah, we'll quiz her on her own book.
Yeah, exactly. We'll quiz. What else has she found out? So as promised, I'm going to thank the other patrons who've waited long enough. They are Paul Hilt in Australia, Bob Hodges in the UK, Bob Moore in the UK, Malte Keisling from Germany, Rob Annable from the UK, Mark Schern from America, Nicholas Gillenstein from Sweden.
Woo! Shout out!
Marissa Davis from the UK, John Bennock from the United States of America, Ben Guthrie from New York, Stash Susha from London, Auden Vala from Norway, Tristram Tupper Hyde from America, Jacob Economy from Honolulu, Gene Watchtonik from Texas, Kenton Hokanson.
Is that Oregon?
Seth Heiberlein from NE. Where's NE?
Nebraska? God, I'm being quizzed
Nebraska.
now.
Oh, yes. Nebraska. Ronald Hatcher. Right in if we got that wrong, Seth. Yeah. Ronald Hatcher.
Live tweet.
from the UK. Neil Hansen. Adam French. Jim King. Oh, you love Jim King. Al Broom. Steve Croucher. And Mark Kelly.
Hi, friends. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for listening and supporting the show. Without it, it would be doomed. And I must apologise for the lateness of this particular episode. The good thing is, Lynn and I got another interview in the bag with an astrogeologist.
Ooh, I guess that's the title. Yeah,
is
it
that
sounds
what we're gonna
cool. We're gonna go with that. Yeah,
and it is a mind-blowingly good interview, isn't it?
I learned so much.
I was so excited, and I unlearned so much as well from that one. That one as well.
There's
it was
a
really
bunch
good.
of things that Big Moon does not want you to know.
Oh my God, there's so many things in there. So that's it. So, yes, have you got any plans, Lynn? Have you got any good guests that you're going to drag onto the show?
I don't know. I've got a couple up my sleeve. My sleeve's
nice.
getting pretty crowded, so I'll see who jostles out.
Excellent. Right, well, that's it. All is left to say goodbye to the Spodcats.
Goodbye, good night, good afternoon, good morning. Bye, friends.
Bye-bye, Spodcats.